Hello everybody, this clip is all about conflict and tension exam technique. So just a quick reminder of our knowledge focus this week. We're going to be looking at the remilitarisation of the Rhineland, the Sudeten Crisis and Munich Agreement, and the Nazi-Soviet Pact and its consequences. Make sure you have revised this content. I'm not going to spend too long on this first question type because we did one of these in our assessment last time. This is one of those questions, again, a 4-mark question where we've got source A opposes, supports, is critical of something, how do you know? So this is the question that's driven by the source and requires a couple of bits of knowledge to support what could be seen. So we've got an example here of a 4-mark question. Source A, an American cartoon from 1938, and it's commenting on the Munich Agreement. Source A is critical of the Munich Agreement. How do you know? Explain your answer using source A and your contextual, your background knowledge. So let's have a think about what we can see. Just spend a moment having a look at the picture. So what can we see in this picture? Your first job, of course, any time that we're looking at anything like this, is to think about, well, what's going on here? So what can we see? Well, obviously, we've got Hitler here as a baby. He's in his Nazi little cot bed there. It's a lovely rocking one, so he can go off to sleep. And he's drinking from the Munich Agreement. That's what it says here on his baby's bottle. And he's also got beside some added concessions, some extra things that he's going to be given. He's been given an awful lot here, plenty of milk, plenty of extra things. He's going to be soothed and off to sleep. And of course, you know, he's being rocked off to sleep. It's all very lovely here for him. But he's got some little toy soldiers at the side, look. So maybe all his thoughts of war and aggression are not yet gone. The title of the piece is really important as well. Shh, he'll be quiet now. Maybe. So they've given in to him and are still not really sure about whether he's got what he wants. Remember, this is commenting on the Munich Agreement, so of course they've given him the Sudetenland at this point. Chamberlain and the rest of Europe are holding their breath, desperately hoping that he falls asleep, stays asleep, and is satisfied with what he gets, what he's got, and wants no more. Now, obviously, at some point, this is going to run out. He's a baby, he's going to wake up, and he is, of course, going to want more. And that's the implication of this cartoon. So we can see that this is critical because everything's being handed over, but it's not going to work because it goes against the nature of the baby. And of course, there's that word maybe that's really, really important. So we also, of course, need to talk about what we know about the Munich Agreement. So you might want to talk about Chamberlain going over 3 times. You might want to talk about him finally giving in when he didn't really want to hand over all the Sudetenland in exchange for peace. And you might want to talk about how we know that that didn't work and that just 6 months later, Hitler had got fed up with what he'd been given and wanted more, and then took over the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. You might talk about how Hitler, from this point onwards, viewed Britain and France, well, the rest of Europe here, as worms and spineless and having no backbone. You might want to talk about how it encouraged him to feel that whatever he did, because now he's on that road with the rearmament, remilitarisation, Anschluss, and the Munich Agreement, all of those things, that he felt he could do whatever he wanted from this point. In order to be successful in answering this particular question, you need to give 2 things, and there's several things here that I've circled and highlighted from the cartoon, and then give 2 bits of knowledge as well to support that. I'm not going to give you a model answer for this one. What I want you to do is be able to kind of think about that yourself. But this is how roughly you'd write it. Source A is critical of the Munich Agreement as it shows, and you pick out one of those things that you can see going on in the picture. I know that, and then you give that bit of knowledge. It's also critical because it shows, and you pick out a second aspect of the picture of the cartoon. I also know that, and you tell me a second piece of knowledge. If you do that and you're mentioning the words, it is critical, you're giving a piece of knowledge, sorry, a piece of the cartoon and then a bit of knowledge, and you do that twice, that is 4 out of 4. So consider what you'd write here. There's no model answer as we did this question type last week. I want you to be able to kind of work that out for yourself now. This next question type is one we didn't do last week. So this is source utility. So this is one where you get study sources A and B, B and C, whatever they are. How useful are sources A and B to a historian studying something? Explain your answer using sources A and B and your contextual knowledge. So this question is driven by the source. You have to use the source, the provenance, the background of the source, and some own knowledge as well. You have to do all three things for both sources in order to be successful in this question type. So here's some general technique for this particular one. So in this question, you are studying how useful sources are to historians studying a certain topic, not just generally, it will tell you in the question. You must consider content, provenance, and knowledge, just as I've just shown you on that previous slide. So this is an answer that will have 3 paragraphs. Your first paragraph is entirely on the first source. You're looking at 2 sources, remember. So first of all, you look at the content of that first source. What can you learn from it about a given topic? You actually select 2 or 3 things at least from the source. So you're actually saying, I can see this. Then think about whether it matches with your knowledge of the events. You also, so you put in knowledge there as well. You think about the provenance, write about the background of the source. You need to consider who, when, why, and should have explained how these things make the source useful to a historian. You don't have to do all of those things, all of the who, the when, the why. You're just doing some of that. So in total, you've got the 3 things in with that first source: the content, the knowledge, and the provenance. You might also put a little bit of knowledge when you're talking about the provenance as well. So you can do knowledge in both of these sections. And then the second source, you repeat with the next source. That's all that you're doing. So again, you're talking about the content, what you can see in it. You link that to your knowledge, and then you consider the provenance as well. But you're also the whole time thinking about how those things make the source useful or not useful to the historian. And finally, you conclude. You answer the question, how useful are these sources? But you're not asked to decide which one is more useful. That's not what this question is about. You're deciding how useful those sources are. And often, actually, they might give a little bit of a different side. And so it might be useful if you take those sources together. Here's an example then of that kind of question based on the Rhinelands. How useful are sources A and B to an historian studying events in the Rhineland? This is a 12-mark question. So source A, we've got The Watch on the Rhine, an American cartoon from the 10th of March 1936. So think about what we can see here. So we've got the tanks in the background. Clearly the Germans are marching and storming into the Rhine, looking very powerful. They've got the big boots on. They're looking like they are doing, a really good job. They are trampling all over. Notice it's tattered and torn and dirty now. Treaty of Versailles and Locarno Pact. And then we've got a second source, which is Hitler speaking about the event some years later. So some years after 1936, a little bit vague there in terms of provenance, isn't it? But we know that it is Hitler giving a speech. At that time, we had no army worth mentioning. If the French had taken serious action, we would have been easily defeated. Our resistance would have been over in a few days. So we're looking at how useful these are in looking at what happened in the Rhineland. So we've got them looking really powerful, and Hitler here saying, actually, we weren't that powerful and we could easily have been stopped. So first, let's have a look at source A, and what can we see? Well, we can see lots of stuff, can't we? We can very, very clearly see here, as I pointed out before, all these tanks, these weapons of war. It's looking as if Hitler is really, really ready to take over. We've got the boots trampling over the Versailles Treaty. We've got the boots trampling over the Locarno Pact. Notice the muddy footprints. Notice how tattered and torn it is. And really what you could say is the amount of disrespect being shown for those treaties by these soldiers. This is not an accident. They're trampling over this on purpose. They've got weapons themselves. They're actually holding guns. And of course, they've got all of this support and backup here. So they're obviously going to be successful. We know they're German soldiers because they've got the swastikas there on their boots. So we don't need to say everything that we can see, but we've got some good starting points there. So how do we write a paragraph on this? So the first thing that we would do is we would talk about the content. So the stuff that we've just talked about on the last slide, we talk about them stomping over it, we talk about the weapons, etc. And what does this tell us? It tells us about it being, them not being stopped, about the disrespect here, etc. And then we'd use our own knowledge as well to support that. So does the source support your own knowledge? So you'd be talking about what we know about, well, why Hitler chose this moment. We might talk about that alliance between France and Russia and Hitler feeling threatened by that. We might talk about Britain and France being distracted by what was happening with Abyssinia. We might talk about Hitler wanting to risk this because this land was very, very important to him as a symbol of what he was achieving. So we talk about what we can see, but also link that to the knowledge of what was going on with events in the Rhinelands and why Hitler chose this moment. And, maybe link it to promises that he'd made to the German people. He had promised that he was going to destroy Locarno and Versailles. You can really clearly see him doing it there. We also need to say a little bit. Remember, we're not saying tons and tons about each thing because we've got to say quite a lot for each source. We then say a little bit about provenance. We think about, well, where is this from? Well, this is an American cartoon. It's from just after the invasion, isn't it? Just after, well, it's not an invasion, is it? It's a rearmament. Just after this remilitarization of the Rhineland, we've got an American cartoon. So it's their immediate and direct reaction. This is them kind of going, oh, you feel a little bit of shock at what the Germans have done. It really clearly shows that the Americans thought this was a disrespectful action and that Hitler was in the wrong. But what you might imply is that the Americans were doing this to signal to the British and French, you need to stop this, that this is wrong behaviour and it needs to be stopped. So this is really helpful to us as historians because we can see that the Americans didn't think that this was the right thing for Hitler to be doing and felt some action perhaps should be taken. So overall, is it a useful source? Yeah, absolutely. It's useful because it shows us the power, the disrespect of the Germans, and it also shows us that the Americans were not particularly happy about what was happening. So in order to help you, here's a few little sentence starters. So source A is useful to study the events in the Rhineland because, it fits in with my knowledge because I know that, it was produced by, this is helpful because, overall this sources, they're the kind of things that you'd need to be writing about each of the sources that you look at. Here's then a model paragraph for that first source. So in green, I've made links back to the statement. The purple is where I've talked about the cartoon and what I can see. The light blue is where I've given some knowledge, and the dark blue is where I've given some provenance. So source A is useful to historians studying events in the Rhineland because it shows how aggressive the Germans were. The Germans have brought all sorts of weapons and tanks into the Rhineland. Their actions are not shown to be peaceful. In addition, the soldiers are walking all over and destroying the Treaty of Versailles and Locarno treaties. They're leaving muddy footprints and have no care for these documents. This demonstrates Hitler's hatred of what was done to Germany following World War I. I know that Hitler desperately wanted to remilitarise the Rhinelands as part of his campaign to destroy the Versailles and Locarno treaties. He'd promised he'd put troops back into the Rhineland in his election campaigns and once he was in power. I also know this was a good time to take over as the British and French were distracted by events in Abyssinia. The determination of Hitler can clearly be seen in the cartoon, and this makes it useful. The source is also useful as it shows the historian an American view from the time. The cartoon sees the Germans as threatening and powerful. This would lead the audience to believe that the Americans believed that Germany should be stopped. This could be seen as a criticism of Britain and France, not just Hitler's actions. All this makes the source useful. What about source B then? What can we see in our second source? So this is Hitler speaking, of course. At that time, we had no army worth mentioning. So what he's saying at the very beginning here is they didn't have a very big army, that they weren't very strong at this point. He says if the French had taken serious action, we would have been easily defeated. So it's kind of making the French look silly here and saying, well, they should have stood up to us, because if they had, they would easily have beaten us. And the resistance would have been over in a few days. That's how weak they were. So in this particular source, Hitler is making it really, really clear that actually this was a massive gamble and that really he shouldn't have done this at this time because he wasn't ready for this kind of action. And he's really making the French look a little bit silly here. So again, let's refer this then to what we should be writing about. So content, so you talk about the no army, you talk about the French, you talk about being over in a few days. So you give those 3 or 4 little things you can pick out from there and obviously relate that to what we know. And then how that supports our own knowledge. Well, we know that actually by 1936, Hitler had already introduced conscription. We know that he'd already been rearming for 3 years. we actually know that he did have an army worth mentioning, that he'd already massively broken the Treaty of Versailles, and that seems a little bit of an exaggeration in terms of him saying we had no army worth mentioning. But, obviously, we do know that he'd given his generals and the soldiers orders to retreat. That is absolutely true. So we know that, and that's something that we'd have to mention when we're giving our own knowledge, that actually Hitler wasn't ready, he felt, for a battle at this point. The provenance in this one is really important because, of course, this is Hitler himself talking. Well, this makes it really useful to us because this is Hitler going, I outfoxed them, I outsmarted them. Aren't I brilliant? Aren't I smart? Because they could really easily have stopped me. We don't know when he's saying this, but it doesn't really matter because it's after the event and after he already knows he's victorious and he's just telling everybody how brilliant and how clever he was. So how useful is it a source? Well, it's really useful because it gives us Hitler's perspective on what he'd achieved with the events in the Rhineland. So again, some little sentence starters, you'd be saying things like, it's useful for studying events because it fits in with my knowledge, because I know it was produced by, and this is helpful because, overall. So all of those are the kind of things you'd be writing in your paragraph about source B. Exactly the same colour coding here as I used last time. So green is where I'm referring back to the question, purple is where I'm talking about the source itself, light blue is where I'm giving some knowledge, and darker blue is where I'm talking about the provenance. So source B is also useful to historians studying events in the Rhineland. In this source, Hitler is saying how his own actions could have gone very badly wrong. He discusses the fact that at this time the French and the Germans had no army worth mentioning. He also says that if the French had put up any resistance, that Germany would have been easily defeated. To emphasise how weak they were, he says they would have been able to be stopped in just a few days. This is very useful to historians. It shows what a gamble Hitler took in remilitarising the Rhineland. I know that Hitler had not really got the support of his army generals at this time, and defeat would have meant the end of his foreign policy ambitions. I also know that Hitler did order his troops to return to home without fighting if they faced any resistance whatsoever. Hitler wanted to gamble, but did not want his troops to fight at this point. They'd only been rebuilding the armed forces for nearly 3 years. This source is also useful as it comes from a speech that Hitler made. It's his own view on the events in the Rhineland. It does reflect the real events. However, it's also useful as it shows how Hitler used the events to show his own cleverness and to emphasise how the French could easily have stopped him. It's therefore had the dual purpose of demonstrating how great Hitler was and humiliating the French. He was looking back at the events knowing that it was successful. It's a really useful source. So how would we conclude this then? So remember, we're looking at how useful are sources A and B to an historian studying events in the Rhineland. So you have to consider both sources, but remember, you're not making a judgment about which source is more useful. That's not what this question is about. So to conclude, the sources are really useful at looking at events in the Rhineland. Source A shows the power and determination of the Germans, whereas B demonstrates this was a gamble for Hitler. The sources are more useful when taken together as they give very different perspectives. The first shows no doubt the Germans would succeed, whereas the second shows that Hitler was prepared to back down if challenged. However, it's clear from both that this was a victory over the old treaties for Hitler and a real boost for his foreign policy. So notice I've talked about both, I've talked about them being used together. The final exam question that you're going to do this week. So remember, we've got 3. We're going to do one of those 4-mark source questions. We're going to do one of the 12-mark source questions where we look at 2 sources, the usefulness question, and we're also going to do a write an account question. So this question, remember, is understand how a sequence of events works. You think about 2 steps of the sequence and link it back to the question. It should be around 2 paragraphs. You might do 3, but usually 2 paragraphs would work for this. It'd be about 10 minutes. So write an account of, we're not going to do a model of this week. It's exactly the same technique as the Abyssinia one we did last week. You need 2 paragraphs which cover the events that are linked to the question. So it could be on anything we studied this week. It could be write an account of the Munich Agreement. It could be write an account of the remilitarisation of the Rhineland. It could be write an account of the Nazi-Soviet pact. So you need to make sure you know those events in detail so you'll be able to write about how they led on to something, such as an international crisis or World War II. Think about which one would make the most sense based on what we studied this week. Homework this week, prepare for the assessment. I need you to learn knowledge of the 3 topics and the technique of the 3 question types. So remember, the 3 topics are the Munich Agreement, the remilitarisation of the Rhineland, and the Nazi-Soviet pact. And the technique is on the full mark source questions, the 12 mark source questions, and the write an account question. That's all we're preparing for this week.